All right. Uh, First question, always the easiest. Can I have your first name, last name, and official title?
Yes, Jeffrey Addicott. I am a professor of law and the director of the Warrior Defense Project at St. Mary's University School of Law, San Antonio, Texas.
Okay, perfect. So there is a lot of buzz about the move to end birthright citizenship. I think the first question everybody has is that even possible because it is a constitutional amendment?
Well, again, yes, it's an amendment to the Constitution. The 14th Amendment, if you read it very carefully, it established the precedent for anyone born in this country to be a citizen of this country. But the Supreme Court has never directly ruled on the specific language. So it's more been a customary principle since 1868 when the 14th Amendment was passed. So many people talk about whether can be challenged in court or not. And again, in our system of government, when people say something's unconstitutional, it's not constitutional, it's not unconstitutional until the Supreme Court says it is. So this is an area that the Supreme Court has never directly ruled on. There's language in the 14th Amendment that says that, the text very specifically has language that indicates that the individual must be subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. And so that's an issue that the Supreme Court's going to have to look at. So the bottom line is that you can have your opinion about whether it is constitutional or it is not constitutional the way it's been interpreted. But this is going to go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is going to decide, because they've never directly decided the issue on point, whether or not simply being born in this country entitles you to become a U.S. citizen. And that's what the question basically is going to be. But in the meantime, the Trump administration is pushing forward with a campaign promise. Now, we've had the ACLU and other attorney generals from different states have joined in to block this. They've gone to a federal judge. Whether the federal judge will issue some type of a blocking order is up to be, remains to be seen. But ultimately, it'll make its way up to the Supreme Court. As a law professor doing this for many, many years, if you ask my opinion, I would say it would probably be a 6-3 decision. There's 9 members in the Supreme Court, or 5-4 in favor of the way we have interpreted it customarily in this country. There is a federal statute, which is 8 U.S.C. 1401, which mirrors the language in the 14th Amendment. So again, very confusing for a lot of people, but the bottom line is the Supreme Court will have to rule on this issue because there are some legal scholars that believe that it's been misinterpreted for the last 100 and something years since it's been passed, and that simply being born here does not entitle you to be a U.S. citizen. And it's true that the vast majority of nations in the world, you're not a citizen of that country simply because you fly to Germany, for example, and have a baby, and now that baby is a citizen of Germany. No, you're not. What we have done by custom, rooted in the 14th Amendment, has existed for a long time, but the Supreme Court has never ruled that the way we carry out that provision is constitutional or not constitutional. So I think that the Trump administration understands that. When the president was signing the executive order, he kind of nodded and said, yes, I realize that this is going to be challenged. So it's not, it's going to be something that our Supreme Court is going to have to interpret. And again, I think probably the Supreme Court, by a narrow margin, will say that the way we've been doing it for the last 100+ years is the way the interpretation should be, that if you're born here, that you are considered a U.S. citizen, but it could go the other way.
Okay, and so what is the process going to be like to get to the Supreme Court?
So it's the ACLU, supported by the attorney generals of some states, have already filed a motion, and well, they filed a lawsuit in federal court to stop this, to block it. The federal judge can do several things. The federal judge can say, I'm not going to issue an injunction, or he can say, I am going to issue an injunction, which means the Trump administration would not be able to go forward. This executive order they signed will not be implemented for another 30 days because you have to have implementing legislation. And they're going to direct the Department of Homeland Security, the Secretary of State, and other agencies to enforce it. So this federal judge might issue a temporary restraining order, and it'll be argued out at the district level. Then it will go to the appellate level of a federal system. Whichever side wins, well, rather, whichever side loses the argument at the district level is going to go to the appellate level. The side that loses at the appellate level will then make an appeal to the Supreme Court. Excuse me. Obviously there'll be a lot of amicus. There'll be a lot of amicus curiae briefs one way and the other, but whether the Supreme Court grants certiorari, which means are they going to hear it, I believe they will. So this is not going to be decided in the next week, the next month. It's going to take probably about a year before it works its way up to the Supreme Court to give us a final opinion about what the 14th Amendment actually means in terms of whether or not simply by being born in this country, you're a U.S. citizen, whether that's correct and whether that's been done correctly all these years or whether it's not correct. So that's the way our system works. The Supreme Court has a tremendous amount of power, and they can change the culture in the country. As we've seen not too many years ago, the Supreme Court decided by 5-4 that marriage is not between a man and a woman. And that was a huge cultural change in the country. Many people thought that would never happen. So many people think this will never happen. But again, a lot of rhetoric where people are saying this is unconstitutional. It's not unconstitutional until the Supreme Court says it's unconstitutional. That would be President Trump's presidential directive on this matter.
Is there any other like legal action that could get in the way between now and the Supreme Court to stop it from even getting to that point?
No, because the lawsuit's been filed. Again, the federal court could issue an injunction. What's an injunction? That means as this case goes forward and the arguments are made on both sides, that it would stop the executive order from going into effect until the case is decided. I believe that's what will happen, is an injunction is probably going to be issued. That will be challenged by the Trump administration. And so it's going to be a long legal battle going forward. But in my opinion, we're probably going to have an injunction that will stop the Trump administration from implementing this presidential directive until the Supreme Court decides one way or the other.
And if, let's say, the Supreme Court did end birthright citizenship, would that somehow affect people who were already born here and have been citizens their entire life, or would it just be kids moving forward?
It would be moving forward. And of course, there's another way to get around the birthright citizenship issue. The Trump administration might try to limit individuals that come into this country to a shorter time stay on their visa. So if you're coming in, you're 6 months pregnant, they could say, well, we're going to allow a visa for a month or 30 days, if you're here on vacation. Because many people have come here with a specific intent of having a child. And for the fact that that child will be a U.S. citizen. So there are several ways that the Trump administration could move forward without this executive order to limit that opportunity for individuals that come into the country. So this seems, very controversial, and it is because our custom for many, many years, for decades, has been to interpret the 14th Amendment as allowing birthright citizenship. But again, the Supreme Court has never ruled directly on the matter. There's one case, of course, in 1895, I believe, that they kind of directly, they indirectly address the issue. But, we'll just have to wait and see. But there's going to be a lot of political rhetoric on both sides about whether this is constitutional, not constitutional. I advise people, let the process play out. We have a process. It'll go to the federal judicial system. It'll reach the Supreme Court. They will make a decision. And that decision will be the rule of law. You can agree with it or you can not agree with it. Again, if you ask my prediction, I think the Supreme Court will rule that the customary practice that we've been engaging in for decades is how they're going to interpret it. That is, the Trump administration will not be successful in this executive order. But I could be wrong. If the Supreme Court comes down the other way, I will not be one of these voices that says it's unconstitutional. No, whatever the Supreme Court says, that's the rule of law.
And once the Supreme Court makes their ruling, there's no going back on it, fighting it, like that's it, right?
Well, once the Supreme Court makes a ruling one way or the other, only the Supreme Court can revisit it, or the Congress can amend the Constitution. So there are ways you can still continue to fight this process if you don't like the ruling of the Supreme Court. You can argue that a constitutional amendment needs to be added to the Constitution to make it very clear what we mean by birthright citizenship. And that will require three-fourths of the states to ratify it. So that's a very, very long process. But yeah, there's still a way, if your view is not upheld by the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court itself can change its mind. Um, and they've Supreme Court in our history of almost 250 years, they've reversed themselves 180 degrees on different matters. And they could, 10 years down the road, they could reverse themselves.
Do you think there's anything important that people need to hear when they watch this tonight, especially with like all the false information circulating and things of that nature?
Yeah, obviously, this is an issue that a lot of ideologues are going to grab onto on both sides of the political spectrum. You're gonna hear the words that this is unconstitutional. Again, it's not unconstitutional until the Supreme Court says it's unconstitutional. And right now, the Trump administration is making an argument that's not outside the mainstream of legal thinking. There are scholars in this country that believe he's correct in his interpretation of the 14th Amendment. There are other scholars that think he's not correct. And that's why we have a judicial system to decide what that language means. And again, the sticking point in the language is going to be the phrase "is subject to the law, is subject to the U.S. And subject to the jurisdiction thereof." That's the phrase that's going to be the sticking point. So the 14th Amendment has that phrase "and subject to the jurisdiction thereof." What does that mean? Does that mean if you're illegally coming into the country, you're ignoring our laws? Are you subject to the jurisdiction therein? Or simply coming into the country, does that make you subject to the jurisdiction therein? So the Supreme Court will look at each word in the 14th Amendment and they'll come up with a decision on what it means. But I would tell people to, just let the process play out. Um, the Trump administration obviously is now in power. They're changing a lot of things that were not done in the previous administration with the executive orders, but they're in power because the American people voted them into power by a majority of the popular vote and by a vast majority of the Electoral College. So we've seen these things before, but we're a nation of laws. Let the rule of law play out. I have my opinion about what the Supreme Court should do. You can have your opinion. Ultimately, the Supreme Court will tell us what this language means.
Okay, is there anything else you would like to add?
Uh, have a nice day.
All right, perfect. Is it okay if I stop recording?
Yes.